Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrive by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 125, we sit down with Ellen Wiener, a visual artist whose work draws deeply from the worlds of landscape, literature, myth, and the natural sciences. Her paintings and prints have been exhibited widely from the International Medieval Conference to the New York Botanical Gardens and are held in major collections including the Smithsonian, Cooper-Hewitt Museum, and Yale University. Ellen reflects on her move from New York City to Greenport in the late 1980s, settling into life on the North Fork, and even working for a time in a shuttered East Marion oyster-packing house. She shares how Floyd Memorial Library supported her early days here, discusses her recent illustrations for Take to the Trees, and offers her hopes for the future of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 124 with Ellen Wiener. This episode was recorded April 10th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really nice to have you on today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So the first question I'd like to ask is what inspired your move to Greenport on the North Fork of Long Island? And then what was the area like when you first arrived?
We came to Greenport for water. My husband, Michael Korchmar, was the captain of the Pioneer, the big 3-masted schooner at the South Street Seaport Museum in Manhattan. He worked in the harbor there for the museum and also before that on the Hudson for Pete Seeger, the Clearwater, and all of those big ships, boats. The Pioneer was a teaching boat back then, and it was part of the social services system in the 70s in New York City. It was used as a training boat to introduce inner city job seekers to the maritime skills. And this is before it was a day trip tourist boat. And he took a lot of people all the way up and down the coast on sailing trips to learn rigging, sailing, working in the galley, all of that business. And he had done a lot of deliveries, including a transatlantic trip and others, navigating only with a sextant. He was needed to do so many repairs on boats in the seaport because they had a lot of boats in their museum collection that he eventually became like the go-to boat carpenter down there, mainly on wooden boats, but other things as well. So what happened was when plans were hatched about renovating the waterfront at the seaport, in other words, cleaning up the fish market and the characters, essentially looking to turn it into a leisure tourist destination. That's when we moved. He couldn't take it. We had a friend, Donald Taub, who was an escape genius from IBM, who had sort of reconfigured his whole life and began working as a caulker and an ironmonger. And he lived in East Marion. And he recommended to Michael, they'd worked together on a lot of boats, he recommended looking into the very recently deserted oyster-packing plant in East Marion. And back then, it had a beautiful little working harbor. and it even had a little beach at low tide. And the carpentry shop we set up was in the old refrigerated section of the oyster packing plant. And that was a huge space. It was large enough to fit 2 or 3 tractor trailers. And it kept the oysters in the trucks and on the belts fresh for days until the loads were full. So you could have access straight from the water all the way into the front of the building on Shipyard Lane in East Marion. And it was so well insulated, we had one tiny little wood stove, and it heated the whole space.
Wow.
When we first went there, we had to disassemble a lot of the sorting and the conveyor belts to make room for the boats. But when the owners left, they left almost everything there. There were hoists, there was offices, office furniture, doors, partitions, phones, there were desks. There were piles of empty order forms for oysters. I still have some. A lot of those cans, those amazing cans, they were just piled up all over the place. It was really strange. Fantastic, though. A little ghostly. But, there had been a few critters, but not that many. This was like in 1988. So it was in not bad shape. And what happened to the oyster packing plant was Hurricane Bob, but I'll talk about that later. For myself, I did do a little bit of work in the boatyard, but I was teaching at Dartmouth that year. So I was commuting on the ferry to New London. But I did set up a studio in the oyster packing plant. I had, I think for the grand rent of $150, the entire lunchroom and the men's locker room.
Wow.
Not that I think there was a woman's locker room, but whatever. It was very clearly stated, sign on the door, men's locker room. Anyway, so we had a daughter. She was 5 months old. And when we moved out here, and I had a crib in the oyster packing plant. I had clotheslines strung up for diapers. It was a little chilly, but, that's what we did. And when we first moved out here, we lived in this apartment in the attic on 2nd Street in Teddy Charles's house. Do you know him? Ever heard of him?
No.
Well, he owned the kind of infamous boat in Greenport Harbor called the Mary E. But he was also a Juilliard graduate and an incredible jazz musician. He played the vibes. And he worked with like Miles Davis and Mingus and Michael's brother and his whole family were musicians. Most of the old guys were Russian violinists. So they actually knew Teddy from a different world too, besides the seaport. So that was a short-term thing, but it was wild,
Yeah.
The town was full of people, really crazy.
Like even on just Main Street and Front Street, was it lively?
It was just totally deserted. It was really deserted. This was going on in Teddy's house.
Oh, okay.
Right? I mean, later on, we moved into our own little house on Carpenter Street. And it turned out that we moved across the street from Poppy Johnson and Fraser and their kids. And that was very good fortune for us. So Greenport was a very different place then. There was lots of boarded up storefronts. There was an abundance of hardware stores, however. They were great. But there were no boutiques. There was a couple of raunchy sailor bars, very good jukeboxes, 25 cents. Mitchell Park was a vacant lot. The weeds were waist high. There was a laundromat. There was the A&P, the Coronet. I think Steve Clark was the mayor of Greenport then, and he also ran the shipyard and owned the shipyard. So that's where the interests of the town lay. Mm-hmm. And it was perfect for us. We really loved it. We had a baby. People love a baby. And like I remember the lady at the shoe store, Brandy's. And I think she was the niece of Mr. Brandy. Like every September, she was so kind to me. She would have saved out a pair of school shoes for my daughter. She knew, she was like a fortune teller about baby kids' shoe size. Anyway, it was really nice because she knew that my mom would visit and buy shoes. Which is great. And, the arcade was there. And we bought everything there at the arcade,
It had kind of everything you could... a general...
It had birthday party favors. It had pot holders. It had extra warm coats. It had trowels. It had fishing poles, underpants, spools of ribbon, plant fertilizer, flashlights, everything. Uh-huh. So it was great. But it was sad also. Uh-huh. I mean, it was not a rich place. Uh-huh.
Yes. And also, you mentioned when we talked previously how important Floyd Memorial Library was for you when you first came to Greenport. Can you share more about how the library helped you settle into the community or even inspired your work?
Yeah. I think I was home from Dartmouth. It was like during a school break. It was probably the middle of winter. And I wandered over to the library with the stroller, with the baby, the snowsuit, the whole thing. And I was standing outside in the street. The door was on First Street then, and it was a grand-looking door.
Yes.
Stained glass and all this, and I was down at the bottom of the steps, looking dirty, exhausted, baby under my arm, and plus I had a huge bag, and I know it was one of those Mills Brothers big red canvas bags that everyone still has, and it was full of all the mail and all the bills that I had to sort. And I was standing there deliberating whether or not we would be welcome. Because the baby, me, was probably wearing like studio clothes. And Lisa, the director of the library, happened to come out the front door, and she stood there with her hand on her hips and said in a very firm voice, "Yes, you are in the right place. Come on, get in here." And we met, and she was really almost like one of the first people I met here. And I just ran into her last week, and you know what? We have had an ongoing conversation for 35 years.
Wow.
Something like that. Almost 40 years, maybe. Anyway, Lisa was wonderful, very smart, very literate, and she listened to me as I would be writing these curriculums for my classes, and she was genuinely interested in how I was teaching. And she recommended many, many books for me because even though I taught painting, I have always used a lot of books in my classes. And she introduced me to a book that I used in my classes for the next 5 or 6 years, I think. And it was Count Zero by William Gibson. And it was my first cyberpunk science fiction novel ever. And I fell madly in love with it. And she just knew everything, right? And I used the book. It was a paperback It was inexpensive. And I used the book to talk about space, right? To talk about perspective as an introduction to the Cubists and the Surrealists. And it really was a big hit. And I loved using it. And I told my students they could read it in the bathtub. It was a sort of anti-academic introduction to spatial perspective. And I was very, very grateful to Lisa. And she kept it coming, too. For years, she would always have ideas for me. And she would order the books so that they became part of the library's collection, but she let me read them first. So I was, a big fan, and I gave her a painting as a thank you. And of course, it featured an open book. And it hung in her office in the library the whole time she was here.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So, and later, when Poppy Johnson started working here, we actually even did some exhibitions together. And I was telling Sally earlier about that. Poppy made this big show with typewriters. Mm-hmm. I was in that. We were both in this exhibition called Footfalls, which used the entire town of Greenport we had a walking map of all this installation art. And we also did a show, which I can't remember what we called it, possibly Rough Drafts or something, which was an exhibition here at the library that had everyone we could think of working drafts, sketchbooks, corrected work, architectural drawings. We had a couple of musicians with their scores showing everything that they changed and edited and highlighted and scratched out with red stuff. And we just put them up next to like the finished work so that you could track the thinking that people actually did. It was a show about thinking. Lots of notebooks, drawings, lists. It was very cool. And Poppy was wonderful that she was very enthusiastic about it. And those two, Lisa and Poppy, even once drove all the way to Princeton. I had changed my job. I was at Princeton then. And they came all the way out there to see an exhibition of my work one time, which I was so flattered. I mean, can you imagine? That is a horrible drive. Ask me, because I did it many, many, many times from the North Fork. And the show at Princeton was all about these books, these illuminated page paintings that were very much about the reading brain married with the visual brain. So it was all the paintings were very much about reading and looking.
No, but just that's a lot. The commuting, even you had to do that to go to Dartmouth, drive all the way up, and then like you mentioned that you've done a lot of long commutes for work.
Well, I think if you're an artist, you gotta do what you
gotta do what you gotta do.
You gotta do what you gotta do. I mean, in those places very far away. I mean, I've also taught at Suffolk Community College, at Stony Brook, at Queens, but believe it or not, those Dartmouth and Princeton were relatively close. Mm-hmm. I mean, I could stay overnight at each of those places, or sometimes I would take like a little apartment there for the semester or whatever. Mm-hmm. But, I drag my kids all over the country.
Yes. But also you mentioned some of your work with the exhibition. Could you talk a little bit more about your work? And it seems like some of it revolves around myth, landscape, and the expansive potentials of reading and looking. Could you elaborate on how these themes manifest in your work and why they are important to you?
Yeah. Medieval books of hours were the basis of maybe 10 or 15 years of work. And most of that work I did here. I really don't think I would have taken my work in that direction if I had stayed in the city. My studio was in the Lower East Side. It was across from a crack den. It was a shit show. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that.
No, you're allowed to say that.
Anyway, let's just say there was a lot of drama. My studio was right next to or across from or diagonally from this club called The World. And believe me, it's not the world I thought was okay for my brand new baby. Right? So, coming here was very needed. And I think it really allowed me to concentrate on work that it's not religious, but I would say it is devotional. And the sources I used then, medieval illuminations, are still very much the compass in my studio work today. Like recently, I did a whole bunch of work using geology, caves, grottos, minerals, all kinds of things like that as metaphorical content for a series based loosely on purgatory. That sort of liminal in-between space. Almost all cultures and religions have a version of it. In general, though, I make visual work that does tend to embrace like an almost a literary way of thinking. And it's not just in the layering of symbols and allegory and iconography I'm interested in. With or without text, I do try to engineer a certain speed of looking, maybe like closer to a reading speed than a gallery looking speed. And which I feel is a bit slower than cruising your way through an art opening.
Yes.
So, and the reason for that is not only is there a lot of detail often in my work, but I find that the combination of when my brain flips back and forth between perception and conception is that, in fact, that slows thinking down, if that makes any sense. And in doing that, there's a little bit of effort. And that effort actually turns out to be an investment. It means they're participating. So I really feel that reading, whether there's text or not in the painting, and a lot of my work does have text in it, poetry and stuff like that. But I feel like it should be an adventure when you're looking into somebody's world. And that world should be full. So, if you were lucky enough as a child, that adventure might have started on someone's lap. If you were read to at night with a storybook, a picture book, and looking and listening to stories and words that way, maybe even had it at a library, where the cadence of the reader, imagine like the teacher in kindergarten, like saying the words really clearly, like chanting them so that every person in the room, every kid sitting there cross-legged, right, could hear. And then they do that ritual, revolve the book around the room this way,
yes,
and revolve it back the other way. I mean, that is like an entrance into another world. It is marked by the slowness and the speed that you are allowed to. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to an opening of a different kind of portal.
Yes.
And I love that when that happens in my work. And I try to do that, whether it's a painting or a book. So I guess what I'm saying is I like the intimacy of that. I like to be invited. I like to get involved and be involved. And I would prefer my paintings to have something to say, along with that great, grand, big feels of color and form and materials. They don't have to be science fiction epics. They don't have to be Dostoevsky. But there should be a world built there, big enough and complex enough for us to enter and dwell in.
Yes. And even just what you showed me before the interview, just seeing some of your drawings and within the books and that other big forest mixed media painting, drawing, it's really impressive, and you can get really absorbed into those worlds, and it does seem like you can get lost. But also, you've had well over 100 exhibitions worldwide. Do you have a favorite or most challenging exhibit that you've had that's important to you?
This is a hard question, but thank you.
It's hard to pick.
There's a couple things that have really pushed me, I would say. A lot of my work is pretty small. It's page size, and it can even fit in the palm of your hand. I make books, of course, as well as paintings, but there's a difficulty there. It's a conundrum, really. I love that one-to-one experience, but that's really hard to exhibit, right? Books are closed, they're covered, they're quiet, they don't speak unless you open them. So the challenge is always how to share and how to make that bookish experience public and really generous. So what I've done in the last while is attempted to take my work for walks, equating the experience of turning a page with something like taking steps. So I made some books that actually extend to 30 feet long. So you can walk you can walk your way down the page. One long page, 30 feet long. I mean, of course, they have to be in sections, but it's a different way of reading. I call them like the walking books. Those were really fun. One of them, Ochre Scriptory, was a very long drawing that essentially is about language, as in scriptory. And it had, I think, 8 different alphabets represented. It had a pictorial history of the typewriter. It had many, many images of pens, pencils, brushes. It had Morse code. It had shorthand, etc., etc., etc. So it was very much a celebration of the book writ large.
Yes.
Another project that was challenging began with a drawing called Longhand Forest. And I had wanted on a big scale to make an ink drawing, just black and white. It had to feel hand-drawn and handmade, and I wanted the means to be pen and ink, really. And so the drawing grew to my entire studio wall, which is exactly 18 feet long. And of course, to make it, I used a lot of printmaking techniques. Xeroxes, glue, markers, all kinds of stuff. And I made it during a time where I actually felt a bit lost. Things were hard. And so I felt like the work had to extend way beyond peripheral vision. So that, in fact, you had to sort of find your way through the maze of the forest. And I based it on the very best opening line ever for all fables, which is, they walked into the woods. So this drawing turned out to be a giant page. It extended in the final version to 24 feet long and 7 feet high, where the story was camouflaged in the hollow panel behind the picture. You had to hunt to find the words rolled up in scrolls in the forest. But here's the great Greenport twist. This was a collaboration with L.B. Thompson, who is our very own Greenport poet, who lives right down the street from where we're sitting now. She's an incredible writer, and her book-length poem altered my drawing's meaning entirely. She actually won a Whiting Award for this work, and the poem itself text is called Fibonacci Monstrosities. And the Greenport Library owns a copy. And it's such a bizarre coincidence, but when she received that prize, I happened to be a student at the Rare Book School taking a class that was being given on medieval illuminations at the Morgan Library. And that is where she got the award. And I was there that day.
Wow.
So it was thrilling, to work with such an awesome writer. And Albie and I went on and made several other projects together, other books. And it's just been wonderful. But we had to build that book out of wood. Mm-hmm. We used all kinds of tubes, and because the text was written in the Fibonacci algorithm in terms of the line lengths, it also had to come out of the forest in the same mathematical spiral. And I had to actually get my math genius kid home from college to help me drill out the holes in the right place with the computer. But we did it.
Wow. And then also just looking ahead at even the work you're making today, or just in terms of new artwork or projects in the future, what are you still working within the same themes, or what other things are you excited to explore in your art, and any other future collaborations?
Well, I am looking forward to this. The last book I worked on is due to come out in exactly 1 month. And unlike most of my other collaborations, this is actually published by Norton, and it's a mass market real book, not an artist book. And it's going to be in actual bookstores, not galleries. So that's a first
nice.
For me. The author is Marguerite Holloway. She had contacted me and commissioned the illustrations for her book called Take to the Trees, which documents conditions in American forests at this time. And Marguerite is the head of the environmental science department at the School of Journalism at Columbia. She's a science writer, but this book has a personal content as well. It charts both the death and the diseases of trees we're having right now, but it's also linked to the loss of some of her close family. But don't be thinking it's all a gloom box, because the emotional trajectory of the book has a lot of joy. Fierce. It's fierce joy. but some really amazing discoveries and personal strengths, because she describes the trials of learning to climb trees at middle age. And rumor has it that the publication party for the book will be in the canopy of a very, very tall hemlock. They promised they'd hoist me up there. I don't know how I'm going to do it. But anyway, wow. I did the drawings. I think I did about 30 drawings. And a lot of people on the North Fork actually helped me locate the trees or good specimens of trees and so forth. I did have to do some traveling. I am an expert on insect spray. Ask me anything. So, Take to the Trees, published by Norton, May 13th.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to have that in the library here. And just lastly, what are your hopes for the future of the North Fork and its community down the line?
The North Fork. Well, there's been a lot to get used to over the past almost 40 years now. But we brought change when we came. I mean, our ways were odd to many. I know the school system thought I was quite irritating as a parent. I went in once and furiously insisted that 3 study halls in a row was an unacceptable schedule for a teenager. I recall suggesting that they just buy the boys a carton of Marlboros for their day-long hangout in the cemetery. I made them put my poor kid in French and Spanish to keep him busy. It caused a ruckus. Of course, I will say that he does speak 3 languages now, which turned out to be rather useful. Anyway, I believe my kids had a remarkable childhood here, and I hope they appreciate it. We've had a few different waves of changes, lots of big motions. Potatoes turned to wine. After 9/11, we got a new batch of folks. We started breeding empty houses in the winter, lower school enrollment, but we also got to learn new cultures. We got poets, we got artists, and funding for some of our town taxes. Hurricane Sandy changed our shoreline, but I still swim most days and even have company now in the winter if I feel like getting Instagrammed to death. During the plague, another wave of population transplants. Some might stay. Who knows? I worked the election that year. There were just not enough people to man the polls because of COVID. I was frightened, but I figured I was a bit younger than most of the regulars. And I want to say that it was an amazing day there in the high school gym. And believe me, I had spent a lot of time in the high school gym already, years. So after seeing no one for months, suddenly I saw 1,500 of my neighbors in a giant flood of humanity. I heard about the new babies, the weddings, the funerals, the divorces, the works. And you know what? It was really an amazing reminder to me of how supported both me and my children have been in our years here. From the very awkward T-ball to the teenie awards, from the school bus drivers keeping my son safe when I was late in collecting him, the oil company cutting a bit of gentle slack, my friends at the dump. I've been very lucky to have made a home here. I moved to a sleepy, quiet, poor town that had a nice small American scandal sheet. The local paper's obituaries were almost always for ancients. The police blotter was a joy to read back in the day. Fences, dogs, naughty bonfires at the beach. The tourists were day trippers then. They purchased, at most, an ice cream cone. And then they went away. And now the roads are packed with fashion stars. But who can blame them? It's beautiful here. After all, we stayed, we listened, we fit in as best we could. Maybe they will too, and help us hold some of the optimism we all surely need right now. I don't plan to go anywhere. Grateful is mostly how I feel.
Wonderful. Oh, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and talk about your artwork and your thoughtful words on the community. So thank you so much.
A pleasure, Christopher. Glad you're here doing this.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 124 with Ellen Wiener. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.